Hello, this is Professor Stephen Shwiff from the Columbia Gorge Community College, and today we're going to look at the case of witchcraft and the historiography covering that topic. Now, we will be focusing on Salem in 1692, which is the famous Salem Witchcraft scare, or witchcraft trials, and we will be giving you a lot of information on different historians and their views, as well as some scientists and others. Now, witchcraft is a great topic to do this with because there are so many different views, and also Salem is a great source to discuss historiography because we have almost all of the evidence that we need. We have all of the trial testimony, we have diaries from some of the main participants in the case, and we have a lot of the participants of the trials and people who were involved at the time later talking about it, giving us more and more information. Now, this would seem to most students that we can figure out the history. What happened? Well, as we'll see, what happened is the source of the question of historiography. Now, why study witchcraft? And this is the introduction to what I was just talking about. History is what we make of it. The interpretation is really more important than the absolute truth. It tells us a lot about what happened at the time, but almost more about what we see and what's going on in our time. And this, as I was saying, the case of Salem is one example of it. Witchcraft in the colonies, and we have to understand the context before we get into the specifics of Salem, was a real thing. Now, we look at witchcraft, and I'm not going to speak for all of us, but most people, I would say, do not believe that there is magic in the world or that there are witches that can affect things through spirits or through magic. However, in New England, with the belief of the Puritans, as we discussed, that God is an active participant, God is choosing who is saved and who is not, this other side of that equation was the devil was very much real. And as you saw in the picture in the first slide, he appeared as a black man. And we'll get into the context of that when we talk more about the Native Americans and how the description of the devil by the Puritans was very similar to how they described Native Americans. Now, witchcraft was a crime in England and in the New England colonies. But what might surprise students is that it didn't become a crime until the 1500s or so. And it was a Protestant view. It was not a Catholic view of the devil actively participating in people's lives. Now, to be a witch, you had to make a bond, a connection with the devil. And you could either be worshiping him, you could have had a conversation with him, but in some way you've agreed to serve him and to work on his agenda rather than God's agenda. Now, before the Salem outbreak, there had been more than 100 court cases dealing with allegations of witchcraft in New England. Most of them had been resolved with one or two accused witches being punished, most often with death, burning at the cross, or just burnings, hangings, things like that. But they weren't ever this widespread. Now, why is Salem the case study? Historians have been fascinated by this type of activity. We still are. How can the accusation of a few adolescent girls turn a town upside down, accusing adults, well-placed people, some not so well-placed, and how could they affect society so greatly? And also, as we've looked back with other hysterias, the Cold War, Red Scare, even the more recent attempts to discover terrorists after 9/11, people want to look back, historians want to look back and try to describe these phenomenons of people letting their fear take over and leading society often to a very dark and bad place. Now, second, I mentioned before, we have much of the information back when Salem was first, when the witchcraft trials first happened, and also subsequently with some of the participants. And so a large body of literature by historians coming in there and writing also have helped with this discussion. Now, as another factor is the fact that Harvard, the oldest university started by the Puritans, is very near Salem. And so as those historians graduate from Harvard with their PhDs, it's an easy place to go get information and make your name as a historian by coming up with a new theory that will shape the debate, or at least affect the debate. Now, as you can imagine, the historians have found many causes and significances. These range from religious, biological, social, economic, psychological, and so forth. What happened? What were the facts of the Salem witch trial? What happened in 1692, and the rough facts are here on this slide, from June through September of 1692. 19 men and women were convicted of witchcraft. Another man who was accused of being a witch refused to testify. Testifying would have led him to lose all control of his property, and therefore his children would not have inherited his property, and so he allowed himself, or he had very little choice other than to confess. He was pressed to death, and rocks were placed on his chest over a several-day period. Each time they said, confess, confess, and he died from this compression of all this weight on his chest. Now, the beginnings of the crisis occurred when there was a separation of the town of Salem. And originally Salem, and I'll have a map in a few minutes, was one section rural, one section town, and there was only one parish church. And so all the people from the country had to come in and go to the town church. Well, finally in 1672, the inhabitants of the village got their own church, got their own government, and in 1689 they hired Samuel Parrish. Now, Parrish had been a failed merchant. He turned to religion or preaching to make money for his family. He brings his family, his wife, his daughter Betty, a niece or two, to come live with him, and he had been trading in the Caribbean and brought his West Indies slave named Tituba, who will be a major player in the early part of the Salem witch trial. Now, Tituba is also an interesting study in history because there's been debate and different analysis of her ethnicity, of whether she was Native American, African American, or some kind of mix of Creole or some unknown designation. I'm not going to decide that for us. Just realize that that's part of this as well, just the whole part of this historiography. Now, in 1692, Parrish was dismissed as a preacher for Salem Village. Now, Parrish had been very unpopular with most people, even his family. There was some strife there. But after he was dismissed, his daughter, niece, and playmates started speaking in tongues and were declared bewitched. Well, before this occurred, Tituba had asked the girls on some occasion if they had wanted to see their fortunes. And we have to understand a little bit about the family dynamic at this point. The girls were adolescents. They were getting to marriage age, which for Puritans were usually in the young teens, 14, 15. It started getting later as time went on. But they would get betrothed or married around this time. So when Tituba asked if they wanted to see their fortunes or their future, it was very related to their marriage prospects. And so as they looked into this concoction, something that I would equate with a fortune teller's ball, they saw something, it disturbed them, they started speaking in tongues, and they started to say that they saw witches. Tituba was one of the first people, and that makes sense. She was, in fact, what we would define as a witch. She would have confessed and did confess to worshiping the devil in some way. But they also accused Sarah Good, who was an older woman, a pauper with a very nasty tongue, had a lot of arguments with neighbors, and Sarah Osborne, who was a ill widow. She had lost her husband and was in control of some property, which we'll get back to, but she at this point was bedridden and not much threat to anybody. Well, it was brought to the general court. The two Sarahs who declared themselves innocent, while Tituba confessed. By the end of April, 24 more people had been charged, and the girls would fall into fits and start saying, I see this woman or this other woman, and occasionally it was a man, but primarily women or their husbands and relatives. And it started to spread. And as it spread, it also started to reach into the more prominent citizens. At first, it was pretty much isolated to the village, and then it starts to spread to the town. Well, by June, the governor convenes a special court. At that point, 150 people were charged with witchcraft. Over the next 4 months, the court convicted 28 of them, most of them women. 5 confessed and were spared. Several escaped. 19 were hung, and the husband of one of the witches, the case I described earlier, was crushed to death under stones. The turning point of the trial occurred when the governor's wife was accused of being a witch, and this was mainly because of his prominence in this trial. And at that point, the governor said, "This is ridiculous," and he forbade any further executions. The people who suffered the most, besides obviously the victims of being accused of witchcraft, were the ministers. And since ministers were in charge of everyone's holy spirit, of God's plan for the community, the ministers had to take a stand on witchcraft. And both Increase Mathers, who was a prominent minister in Boston, and his son Cotton, who had followed in his father's footsteps, were believed in witches, had written about witches. Increase Mathers had a book about witches written long before Salem, about another case that he was involved with. And Cotton had taken up the Salem witchcraft trials, just like his father had taken up that earlier case, and was very interested in the events. Well, Increase Mathers came to his senses, in my opinion, quicker, and had told this governor to stop looking at spectral evidence. And this was evidence of the children saying, we see a ghost, we see a spectral, some kind of image of the devil bewitching them, often or most often in the form of these women who were supposedly who had made a compact with the devil. Now, the event showed that the anxiety about Puritans had on women, since many of the accused were widows of high status, older women who owned property, and women who lived apart from the daily guidance of men. Now, this makes sense because the girls who were making the accusations were of an age that they were most concerned about who they would marry. Because, as we'll see, the division between the town and the village had left the town folk vulnerable. If you married a boy from the city, there was some fishing going on, there were some businesses going on, and this would have been very prosperous for a girl to marry into that type of family. However, if they married into their local community, into the village, they were probably facing a life of some deprivations, hard times, making do with what you could grow on your farm, that sort of thing. So the girls, if they were going to accuse somebody of taking something away from them, or of, based on their envy, it would be these women who had extra power in this community. Most women, as we talked about in the colonial family lecture, had no power over their property. The men, as soon as they got married to them, had total control over the women's properties, anything they got from their fathers, anything they inherited from their husbands would have been their new husband's property and under his control. Now, these women that were accused often had some stake in property, usually controlled because they had no man in their life or had made some kind of bargain before they remarried to keep that. So this is, the women's gender issue that we'll get to towards the end of this lecture. Now let's look at a various group of historians and their views. I am only going to give a very quick summation of most of these views. You can pause the video at any time to read what is the background and more information. Also, these are great topics to do additional research or to find in your textbook the background of these. But let's look at these interpretations. I have them listed here. Traditional interpretations include community tensions, and this is what I was talking about with Salem Village versus Salem Town. The loss of mission idea, we're going to go over each one of these as we go through this. Wars, economic crisis, the idea of medical epidemics, two of these different illnesses, and now the new interpretation, the role of gender. And even that, I'm using new loosely because there continue to be innovations and discussions throughout the historical society. Community tensions, loss of mission. This was the idea that witchcraft is happening because the society is under stress, and I described this stress earlier between the village that's prospects are going down and the town who's trading and shipbuilding has their town on the uphill going up. And here you can see a picture of Salem in the 1760s. Now, what were the stresses for Salem? First of all, the loss of that pure Puritanism, if you'll pardon the phrase, that had come over with the Puritans. They had been looking for the city on the hill. They were going to create the city on the hill where Christianity was going to be practiced perfectly. Well, by this point in the 1660s and 70s, mercantilism, business had taken over for a lot of people as their, quote, religion, unquote, and this had left a lot of religious people drifting. We'll see in a subsequent lecture about the First Great Awakening that a lot of people did find religion to fill the hole that was being created by business and by kind of society becoming more and more separate. But here in Salem, this was a stress. Now you also had the second aspect was the government of Massachusetts Bay, and this is the entire colony of the state of Massachusetts now, including Maine, Plymouth, some other areas. When Charles II had come back into power after the English Reformation, the king had put a royal governor over the town of Massachusetts, and so they had left it to be controlled by the British, even more so than previously. Third, the Puritans had lost their sense of individual identity, as well as their sense of cultural purpose. They, and not God, had settled the wilderness where Satan lived, and if they were living in the wilderness, making a life of that, they were living under Satan's rules, and a lot of them felt lost by that. Now this will tie into some of the other theories, including the Native American theory, as we go along. Other tensions, war. Mary Beth Norton in The Devil's Snare felt that the people in Salem were feeling concerns over the Native American battles, massacres and battles in Maine, King Philip's War, where the Wampanoags who had been the friends of the early pilgrims, now were at war under King Philip, and the stress was great. Several hundred colonists died, many more natives died, but this was overturning a lot of what the Puritans believed, and they thought that they were the blessed people, that God was taking care of them, and now the natives were a threat. They weren't their friends, and they tied the natives with Satan. And since so many people were dying and the war was not going well all the time, there was a feeling that maybe that God's forces, the Puritans, were losing the battle. Now, Norden talked about some of the different aspects of this in her book, and like I said, you can stop the slides to read over some of her findings. In Salem Possessed, Boyer and Nissenbaum found that the economic crisis that we've been discussing, and they first put forward the theory that I've already touched on, this break between Salem Town versus Salem Village. Here's a map of that breakdown, and as you can see, the accusers were mainly from Salem Village, while many of the accused were living in the town or closer to the town. It does spread farther than this and even reaches Boston, but by that point, many historians discount some of the factors. At that point, it was more of a how far can they stretch this, or how far can they reach before this was put down by the ministers and the governor. And like I said, the governor's wife being accused of being a witch was certainly one of the final steps. And we can see on these slides just some more of Nissenbaum's and Boyer's arguments. And here we have the basics of the issue between the two, that the village was not going to have enough land to be divided among all the heirs of the farmers who lived there, and therefore a lot of wayward children would be left without property to live off of. They would be forced to go find some kind of wage in the town, which was not a promising prospect for people during the 1700s and 1800s. Wage incomes really take off after the Revolution, American Revolution, with the Industrial Revolution and wages, money coming into the factor. And of course, we'll discuss that in some detail as we get to that in the course. So the people in the town were going to be forced out, while the people in the town were going to benefit and grow in getting cheaper workers, making money off business, while the people in the village were going to be forced off their land. If there were 3 sons, only one could really inherit the farmer's land, and the other 2 would be left scraping out a living for the rest of their life. So this added a lot of tension, and for the women who would be powerless in the situation, according to Nissenbaum and Boyer, they lashed out in these witchcraft allegations. Now the next theory is the medical argument that possibly a couple of different problems may have caused the Salem witch trial. Ergot is an herb that I'll show you a picture of in just a second, but they cause some of the reaction, some of the images that these girls presented, as far as seeing images. They're a little bit hallucinogenic, and there's some signs that climate would have led to this being there in the diets of these young women. And here's a picture of the ergot on the rye. Now, the ergot would have caused some of the behavior, but you also have to understand that it was a very limited group of girls who made these allegations. And there may have been some of this disease present, but how do you explain that it didn't affect some of the adults? Why weren't they seeing things or becoming part of the group that saw witches? And why did it continue for such a long time after these girls were being examined and conditions were changing over the year? And here you can see how the symptom of ergot affected female animals. And once again, we have no direct proof, but it is an interesting theory and a possibility. And I'm not going to comment on every slide. I'll allow you to stop and read over these as we go forward. Encephalitis was the medical argument that Laurie Carlson offered. This also had the symptoms that many of the girls described, such as pinching, pricking, fits, hallucinations. It also affects livestock, and so there were some signs that this was in existence because of some of the reports we have about livestock happening in Salem at around the same time. It's spread by mosquitoes, and so the girls who lived in the marshy area in the village would have been more susceptible. But once again, if we're getting information about animals, why aren't we getting more information about people being exposed to this? That would be my doubt on this. But it's possible that this could have contributed or been the cause. Now, the most recent interpretation, and the one we're focusing on as the final one, is the role of gender. And why are the women accused of being witches, and why are witches usually seen as women? Because at the time, they weren't. As you can see with several of the men who were accused, there was no distinction, no new name to call them other than witches, and being a witch was simply consorting with the devil, as we talked about. So why are women the focus of the accusations, and why were so many of the accused young women? This has been approached by several historians, first by John Damos in his book Entertaining Satan, and you can see his statistics that the accusers, as we've discussed, were primarily young single girls ages 11 to 20, and most of the accused were older women past their 40s. Once again, most of the society would have seen the most useful women to society as those in childbearing years. So you have here really the ranges. I mean, there were, of course, people having children in their teens, but for the most part, Puritan women would be having the majority of their children between the ages of 20 and 40. And of course, you have some women having children after their 40th birthday during this time. So why are these two ranges? Why are the young, pre-menstrual women, for the most part, or just starting to be of childbearing years, accusing those who are probably post menstrual or just entering into their menstruation, post-menstruation years, and of course, the exception of those family members, sisters, brothers, husbands, maybe a child or parent of an accused witch. But why are these two groups, the young women and the old women, at the two ranges? And to Demos, this pointed to a generation conflict. And as I've described, part of it is the young girls looking at their future and not seeing as bright a future as these older women have had or are having. Part of it is also that the women in the family were used as the main disciplinarians, and the men were seen as conductors of messages, teaching about religion, while women were left to discipline the children and teach them right from wrong, things like that. You also have the idea of Freud and his relationship between the mother and daughter, and the father and the son and daughter, son and mother, being influential in the development of the human psyche. Now, Demos sees the society as mainly oral, or witchcraft is mainly oral, with bites, screams, speaking in tongue, gnashing of teeth. Salem was certainly a town that had a lot of issues between the residents, and this is probably common in small towns or in any area that people are gathered together. And you see this in court records. You see many of the accused witches were these same people brought into court by others. And in our subsequent lecture from this one about disorderly women, we'll see that this idea of troublesome women who stepped outside of the bounds of being a housewife, of being a mother, were often accused of being witches, being ungodly, and were subject to often civil laws. And Demos argues that the witchcraft trials were somewhat of a social control, that witchcraft was the way that society tried to control women, put them back in their place that they should have held as wives and mothers. Here, Demos on this slide describes the theory. I'll leave it for you to read over and understand. One interesting aspect that we talked about in the family lecture, the differences between Massachusetts and the Chesapeake mainly, was that the fact that children were sent out of their families, natural families, to be raised by others. And this was for the discipline, that Christian parents felt that they couldn't put aside their love and affection for their children long enough to discipline them harshly enough to force out any type of bad behavior. And of course, a stranger to the children could do this because they saw the danger of bad behavior, of ungodliness, was eternal damnation. And for the Puritans, just like the devil is very real, so is hell, so is purgatory. And so the women took on the role of disciplining children, even beating their bad behavior out of them physically, and this would have caused tension between the women and children. Now, even as adults, parents, the older women, would still ask for respect and guidance, and you can see here that this very close society would have caused a lot of tension between young adults hoping to start their own lives, being tied down to their parents, living in the same house, working on their farms. There's an interesting video called The Midwife's Tale and book by Laura Urich that is available through American Experience. I would recommend seeing just to see what type of lives people lived and some of the tensions that they created. And here is Demos's conclusions. Why were the hostility directed towards mothers and women in that motherly role? It was because of this discipline. And Demos saw that this would be a natural target for girls that might not be satisfied with their lives. So there you have several theories and ideas about the Salem witch trial. We'll pick up on some of the same ideas and topics in the Disorderly Women, breaking away from purely witchcraft to some of the behaviors of women like Anne Hutchinson and Hibbins. But look these over, think about it, and consider some of these historians' books and articles about these topics for more information. And Salem, like I said, is extremely popular. There's lots of good videos available as well. And so I hope you enjoy learning about this topic even more than we covered in this one lecture. Thank you.